Hello everybody, welcome back to another video, and in today's video I'm going to be going over how to set up and use the PS5 without any sort of internet connection or firmware updates at all. So I'm going to be splitting this video up into two different sections. The first section will be going over how to set up your PS5 offline, and the second section will go over what you can and can't do offline without any firmware updates. Now keep in mind this video is mainly focusing on just the system only and not on the game, so I won't really be going into much detail about any of the games except for Astro's Playroom, which is the game that comes with the system pre-installed. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So setting up your console is actually pretty simple if you have no internet. All you need to do is go through the first time setup as you normally would. And when you get to the part where it asks you to set up your internet connection, just select the do this later option and proceed with the rest of the setup normally. And afterwards, you will have successfully set up your system offline. So I figure if you have no internet to set up the system, you probably won't have the internet to download firmware updates as well, which is why I wanted to go over what you can and can't do without updating the firmware. Now, keep in mind that some of the systems manufactured after launch will probably have newer firmware versions included pre-installed on them. So some of this stuff may not be the same when you get your system, but hopefully this will still be pretty helpful. So if you set up your system offline and skip the firmware updates, then you'll be able to do pretty much everything you would expect to do. At least almost everything you'd expect to do. So you'll be able to play PS5 games, you'll be able to earn trophies, record gameplay clips, take screenshots, and even copy them to a USB flash drive. And I can also confirm that you can watch 4K Blu-rays offline without any sort of need for any firmware updates or one-time connection or anything like that. Unlike the PS4, which the PS4 did require a one-time connection to watch Blu-rays, so it's nice that they changed that up with the PS5. Now keep in mind that some Blu-ray movies that are released later on may require a newer PS5 firmware version in order to watch, like the PS3 did. But at least as of launch, all of my 4K Blu-rays work perfectly fine on the PS5, so that's pretty cool. Now, let's get into what you can't do without updating the firmware. So probably the biggest feature on the PS5 that requires a firmware update to access is the PS4 backwards compatibility. That's right, you can't play any PS4 backwards compatible games on the PS5 without the day one firmware update. Now keep in mind, if you do install the firmware update, you will still be able to install and play PS4 games without any other updates or internet required, but you will not be able to play PS4 games until you download at least the day one firmware update for the PS5. However, if you have no internet to update the firmware, I do have some good news. Just like the PS4 before it, there is a couple of options you have to update the firmware on the PS5 without needing to connect your PS5 to the internet. So the first option is to update via a USB flash drive. Now you'll still need internet of some kind to download the firmware update and put it on the flash drive. However, this method will let you, update your firmware without needing to connect at least your system to the internet, which is pretty cool. The second method is for people with absolutely zero internet access whatsoever, and that is updating the firmware via PS5 game disks. So yeah, the PS5 game disks can actually include system firmware updates on the game disk, and you can install them without needing to connect your system to the internet at all, as long as that game disk requires a firmware version that you don't have. Now, unfortunately, there aren't any game disks available at launch that have the required firmware on them to play PS4 games. However, I expect that to not be the case anymore as more PS5 games release. And also keep in mind that if you buy your PS5 after the launch, chances are your PS5 will probably come pre-installed with a newer firmware that will be capable of playing PS5 games out of the box. Now, the second thing that will be limited if you don't download any updates whatsoever is the pre-installed game, Astro's Playroom. Now, this game is playable if you don't install any updates. However, there is some missing content and other minor differences if you do so. The game will display this message upon booting up the game saying that you're running an outdated version of the game. However, you can just press the X button on this and play the game normally. However, the non-patched version of the game is missing its final level as well as the speedrun mode. It is still entirely possible to earn the Platinum Trophy without updating the game, but just know you won't be able to play the final level or the speedrun mode without updating. And there's a few extra trophies that are going to be available if you do patch the game. So yeah, it is entirely possible to platinum the game, you just won't be able to do the final level or anything like that. There are also a bunch of other minor differences between the unpatched firmware and the patched firmware. However, if I went over all of them in this video, I'd be here all day. Just note that the rest of the changes between the unpatched and patched firmware are all pretty minor and honestly don't really matter at all. Anyways, that's basically all the information I have to say about setting up and using the PS5 offline. For those wondering, I did play some of the launch games without updates, and for the most part, they work fine too. I actually even went in Platinum Spider-Man, and I had a few bugs and crashes with that game, but for the most part, it actually worked fine without updates. I also played Sackboy: A Big Adventure, and there was a few small graphical issues during, like, I think about 2 of the cutscenes, but the game itself played fine. I don't think it crashed or anything like that on me. And I also played Demon Souls pre-patched, and that game was like basically perfect. I seriously didn't encounter a single bug in my entire playtime of that game. And a few of my other friends who also played the game pre-patched also said that they didn't encounter a single bug playing that game pre-patched. So that game is basically perfect if you play it pre-patched, which is pretty cool. And also, as for my thoughts on the PS5 system itself, I quite like it. The system firmware itself is pretty unstable right now, unfortunately, both with and without the newest firmware, which kind of sucks. However, the console itself is pretty solid. The ray tracing and the adaptive triggers are really awesome features, and the PS4 backwards compatibility is fantastic. One thing I didn't mention in the video is that PS4 backwards compatibility is so good, it can actually run PS4 games way better than the base PS4 could, which means if you had any base PS4 games that ran really terribly off disk, then the PS5 might actually make them playable again. Just note, it won't actually fix any bugs, just the frame rate. So if a game was like extremely buggy, then the backwards compatibility probably won't help with that. But if the game ran really terribly but didn't have a whole lot of bugs, backwards compatibility will definitely help with that. So it's really useful for playing games like Lichdom Battle Mage and Homefront: The Revolution pre-patched, because while those games weren't especially buggy, they did run terribly. And the PS5, I played both of those games on the PS5, and they run amazingly, at least compared to how they did on base PS4. So yeah, definitely use the PS4 backwards compatibility on PS5 if you have no internet, because it can make a lot of PS4 games that ran terribly a lot better. But yeah, anyways, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.